Welcome to another edition of Doc Talks. We are here to talk about flood insurance and flood risk on waterfront properties in Central Texas. Hagen, start us out.
Yes, sir. So flood risk is something that's a super hot topic. People are very sensitive to it. We've had some events over the last 6 months to a year, and so it's something that comes up a lot. But please do not rely on Zillow to tell you what the actual flood risk is for a property. They've got, just like they do for home values, they have formulas for risk rating on homes. And what it's not accounting for a lot of times is the elevation of a property. Most all of your property will have some sort of flood risk, specifically down by the water, unless you're on a bluff. But what it can account for is if the home is 30 feet above the water. I had this happen recently. I had a client call me and said, I'm looking at that house that you sent me, and it says it's a flood risk 10 out of 10. And I looked at a map, and I said, actually, that street, the houses are 30 feet above the water level. And there's no way that house, I shouldn't say no way, it's highly unlikely that house is ever going to flood. But they were looking at it online, and they never would have even considered it had they not called and talked to somebody that knew the lay of the land and kind of how that worked. And so really important to have somebody on your side that can give you some insight into the history of various properties around the lakes, what's flooded, what hasn't. So that's what we're experts in.
I mean, even looking at the FEMA flood maps, it can give you a false reading of where the property is, the home is, in
absolutely. Relation
to, because it may show the home's in the floodway, but the home's built up 10 or 12 feet, it's out of the floodway.
Yeah.
So, and the current rules with the county is, you got to, if you build a new home, it's got to be 2 feet above the floodplain.
Sure.
So, something I'd like to mention about this is, there are times when the government shuts down, and during those times, you cannot get flood insurance on a new policy. Now you can't transfer them. Most policies are transferable, but you have to check with the agent, of course, to make sure it is. But you can still get private policies, but you can't get a new NFIP policy on a purchase if you're buying a new home. And even the rates for those that are more likely to flood seem to be cheaper, and the ones that are out of the flood zone. My home's in the zone X, above the floodplain on the lake. It just went from $1,100 a year to $1,800 a year. And I'm not going to renew it because the odds of me flooding are pretty slim. But it just keeps going up for the people that are not going to flood, and then it comes down for the people that are going to flood. It just doesn't seem fair. But rob Peter to pay Paul, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, so be careful of times of government shutdown, which we're currently in. You can't get a new policy. So check and see if you can get one transferred.
And a lot of times those grandfather policies are going to be significantly less. You are starting at a rate that may have been given 10 years ago. Now those policies will still go up incrementally year over year, but I've seen instances where an existing policy, and you do have to have an agent that knows how to help you get a seller to cooperate in doing this, but where an existing policy may have been half or 3 times as less as going out and sourcing a new policy.
And an elevation certificate will also usually help lower it, the flood insurance as well. So, sometimes they don't have one. And so when you're getting a new survey, it might be good to go ahead and have the elevation certificate done as well. Or,
Doesn't cost that much.
And I've researched back through MLS on previous sales and been able to find one from a couple years ago that maybe the current owner didn't have. So just using some of our resources to help figure out ways to save you money in that's kind of what a good agent is here for. So
that you can also use an elevation certificate, and I've had this happen just a handful of times. But if you're in the 100-year floodplain, or certainly the floodway, which is a part of that, you're going to be required, if you have a federally backed mortgage, to carry flood insurance. Well, sometimes a home may be close to the floodplain, or a flood map is a little bit deceptive. And so getting an elevation certificate can actually help you prove to your lender that you don't actually need to carry a flood policy.
Right.
And they may have just tried to stick you with a $2,500 a year policy. So run that out over 10 years, and having an agent that understands how that works just saved you $25,000.
And when I take on a listing, we have them, you have to fill out a seller's disclosure. and it has a flood section on there, floodway, floodplain, and you have to.
That's the absolute truth.
And no. So what I do is when I get a seller's disclosure, I go and look at the FEMA flood maps to make sure that. And I did a listing presentation this week for a gentleman, and he says my home is not in the floodplain. And I'm looking at it on my phone as he's showing me the map he has, and I'm like, no, you're in the floodplain. And he didn't want to argue with me, but he wanted to get another source to verify that it was. And I'm like, I'm looking at the current map. It's in the floodplain.
I had the same on a seller just recently, and they said, our house isn't in the floodplain. And we said, yes, here's the map that shows it. And they said, well, when we bought it, our agent didn't tell us, and we paid cash. Well, that's why
Maps
you paid
change.
cash.
Yes.
You didn't have to have it. You weren't required to have it from your lender, so they didn't know, and their agent didn't tell them.
Yeah. Yeah. So don't always trust the seller's disclosure.
In addition to that, regarding seller's disclosures, like if being very sensitive to flood risk is something, or past flooding, and we can talk about values. Billy, I'll let you talk about like home values, but if being sensitive to that is something that are keen on, a lot of times sellers don't know if their house is flooded before, right?
Right.
And they may check never flooded. Well, somewhere in the chain of ownership on previous disclosure, and it may not be them that's not telling the truth, but maybe the previous owner didn't disclose the truth about a house having flooded.
Right.
So,
Or they inherited a house that didn't know flooded.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But having a base, if that's something that's important to you,
For sure.
and there are a lot of other rules and regulations we can get into regarding past history and damage reports and things, but if that's something that's important to you, we're aware of where the source to get that information. And how that's available to the public. So
it's extremely important to have an agent that understands flood waters and flood plains and flood maps to help you guide you selling or buying.
Not just your friend that sold a couple houses and needs,
That's a full-time teacher and does this on the weekends. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so we can talk about value, right? So houses that are more prone to flood tend to be a little less dollar-wise overall, and houses that have never flooded tend to bring quite a value because there's a history there.
Yeah.
And I think that's we look across the entire Central Texas waterfront, whether you're looking down here in the Guadalupe Lakes or on the Highland Lakes. I mean, houses that have never flooded, that means a lot.
Yeah.
In the last 10 years, we've had 2 big high water events in Highland Lakes. And so knowing which ones of those areas had water in them is kind of important.
It's a comfort level for an owner of a
For
home.
sure.
Now, do you see a difference between it being a primary residence and a secondary, where secondary, we don't care so much?
For sure.
Primary, we do care extremely.
you may have grandma's grand piano in the front room, and
Yes.
if you're at an elevation and that house is flooded 3 times, probably not going to be real enthused about that. So,
Right.
Yeah, definitely. I have a number of buyers who are perfectly willing to accept the risk for the lower cost.
Yeah.
I mean,
But it's going to be a second home.
It's going to be a second
Investment
home,
property.
and exactly. So I actually had a call with an agent recently who is from Illinois or Indiana, I forget, but she's looking to relocate to Central Texas. And we started having a conversation. She said, I do not want a house that's anywhere in the floodplain. And she starts telling me about a lake house that she currently owns up there. And she said, well, I know that I don't have to carry flood insurance because my house is on stilts and I'm 20 feet up in the air. It doesn't matter how high you are above it. If your pilings or your foundation are on the ground and it's floodplain, you can elevate yourself above the base flood elevation, but you cannot get yourself out of the floodplain. So I decided not to get into an argument with her at that point in time, but I knew that I was right because I've seen a few of these and I've worked with a few lenders that I know we're going to require it in that exact same situation. We see elevated homes quite a bit along the lakes that we worked on here.
So if you're looking to purchase a waterfront property, call the experts who know about floodplains. See you next time. See you on the lake.